one of the interesting things that I found about the extremists in Luton was that they were not poor people. They were not they're not even working class. They were middle class. They had been given pretty much everything that anybody could be expected to have in the UK. A lot of them sort of were highly intelligent. They worked as medical students, or they were working in architecture or engineering. So there was no trauma. There was no poor education. There was no poverty involved. These were normal people. In fact, they were above average in wealth. They were above average in education. And so I realized that all of the traditional explanations that were particularly being given by the left were wrong about Islamic extremism. And I actually realized that a lot of it really just stemmed to...
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I would like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's podcast, we have got another excellent guest. He is a writer, and I have been following his work for quite a while. He's a very insightful man. He is hailing from the UK, and this is Gurwinder Bhogal. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Zuby. Pleasure to be here.
No doubt. Gurwinder, I've done a very brief intro there, but please introduce yourself to my listeners.
Okay, yeah, so I'm originally from the tech industry. I worked on search engines early in my life. And when I was working on search engines, I analyzed human behavior. So I was looking at what people were clicking on, what sort of searches they were making, and what sort of websites they were visiting. And I was doing this to sort of perfect the algorithms, the search algorithms at Microsoft Bing. And one of the things I realized was that even though the algorithms we had were actually really good, we were giving people good information, people were rejecting it, and they were just doing whatever they wanted to do. They were sort of clicking on really, really low quality information that was basically just straight up false. And so what I realized then was that it didn't actually matter that we gave people good information or bad information, because what the real problem was not the technology, it was the psychology. It was that people would actually reject good information if it didn't fit their biases. So the real problem was the biases. And so after that, I left the tech industry and I became a lot more interested in trying to debug the human brain. And so I did a bit of work on extremism, trying to understand why people become extreme. The prevailing sort of wisdom was that it was caused by algorithms and all this sort of stuff. But because I had a background in this, I realized that wasn't actually the case. So I studied Islamic extremism. I became interested in understanding other forms of extremism, such as wokeism, white nationalism, and other forms of extremism. And since then, I've been writing about the ways in which the brain becomes deluded through biases, fallacies, and trying to understand why people become extreme and deluded in their views.
Okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. When did you start working in the tech world, and when did you leave it?
So I started working in tech around 2009, and I only worked there for like about 4 years, because in 2013, that was when I left. Well, I actually left at the end of 2012, and then I basically moved to Luton, which is your birthplace, which is your hometown. And yeah. And as you know, in Luton, it's quite notorious for having been the stronghold of Al-Muhajirun, which is the UK's most dangerous jihadist organization in Bury Park, which is a sort of Muslim enclave within Luton. So I moved to the heart of Bury Park. This was sort of at the time when Tommy Robinson was sort of in his ascent, and the English Defence League was sort of rebelling against what was perceived to be the Islamification of the UK. So I went down there to try and work out what was going on, why there was a lot of conflict in this town. Again, this was being blamed on algorithms. Like at the time, the media was blaming this on Facebook. They were saying that Tommy Robinson was recruiting people through Facebook, that the Islamic extremists were recruiting people through Facebook. So I was not so sure about that. And so I went down there and I actually I pretended to be a Muslim because I actually speak the same language, because I'm from ethnically Punjabi, the same as the Islamic extremists in Luton. They're from sort of Kashmir, which is close by, and they speak the same language as me, Punjabi. So I basically pretended I was one of them, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with them, basically, to try and work out why they were believing the things they were. And I was in Luton until 2018, so I was there for 5 years. I wasn't studying extremism for all of that time, but for a lot of it I was, and it gave me some really powerful insights into why people become extreme, and it's nothing to do with what people think. People think it's the usual things like that these people are oppressed in some way, that they're alienated, or that they're just not educated. It's just not true.
This episode is brought to you by Sambrosa, the best way to get your 8 hours of rest. If, like me, you sometimes struggle with nighttime restlessness and allergies, then Sambrosa Night Syrup could be a game changer for you. Sambrosa contains a natural base of 7 organic herbs, honey, and a small amount of antihistamine. It's effective and soothing with no harsh chemicals, no high fructose corn syrup, and no artificial flavors or dyes. I've been using Sambrosa for several months now, and I can personally vouch for its effectiveness when it comes to improving my quality of rest at night. I also love the fact that they're a family-owned company who share my values of faith, freedom, and integrity. My listeners can try Sambrosa today and get 10% off by going to sambrosa.com/Zuby10. That's SAMBROSA.com/Zuby10 for 10% off your order. Try Sambrosa today and wake up ready to embrace life's opportunities. Go to sambrosa.com/Zuby10 and try it out. I mean, the first thing that jumps in my mind is I'm curious, what is it about you and your personality or your background that made you even want to go so far to understand that phenomenon? Because a lot of us are interested in a lot of things, but very few people would go undercover and live in a certain part of Luton and essentially infiltrate a group to learn why they're thinking in such a way, particularly if you're in strong disagreement with them. What was it that prompted you to do that?
Yeah, so the thing is, I was very young and I was coming out of the tech industry, and I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to explore human psychology. Initially, what I did is I wrote some pieces about psychology and I submitted them to the usual outlets, the New York Times and all that. I was quite naive, and obviously I was rejected because nobody wants to read, psychological musings of some, tech worker in his early 20s. And so I realized I wasn't going to get into this industry through the usual avenues. I wasn't going to be able to go through the mainstream, if I wanted to write about psychology. I didn't have a PhD in psychology. I didn't have any experience in the field of psychology, so nobody was going to take me seriously. So in order to be taken seriously, I realized I was going to have to do something drastic. I was going to have to do something that nobody else would dare to do. And so I decided to just take a crazy leap. I had a few friends around in Luton area at the time, and it was nearby London, and I thought, that'd be pretty cool just to live there, and I can do a bit of research in London. I can also, in Luton as well. And so at the time I was single, I didn't have any sort of nothing tying me down to any particular place. And so I decided just to go down there and just live in the heart of where all this conflict was taking place and just analyze it, and try and work out what was going on. Originally, I was going to write a book about it. But what happened was that after I'd written quite a bit about it already, most of the people that I was studying were either killed or arrested. There was a big crackdown in 2016 because a lot of the people that I was around in Luton, they went to join ISIS between 2013 and 2016. And then there was a massive crackdown in 2015, in which just all the leaders of al-Muhajirun got basically arrested because they'd been encouraging people to go to fight for ISIS in Syria. So after that happened, and I lost most of my research material because they were all in prison or dead. And so I decided to shift away from that towards other forms of extremism. But I kept all the lessons that I learned during those few years in Luton. I learned so much about extremism firsthand.
Tell me about some of those lessons.
Yeah, so as I said before, so one of the things that was being blamed on extremism was either it was the algorithms or it was people were alienated. There was a lot of talk about people being racist to Muslims and that the racism was causing Muslims to become extreme. Or there was like some kind of poverty or some other trauma. Trauma was a big one. People were talking about some unresolved trauma that these people had. And I kind of just thought, that doesn't really seem right to me because
I can already picture the people.
Yeah.
I can already picture the type of people doing these analyses because it's just off the bat obviously wrong.
Yeah. And even the moment I heard it, I thought this just doesn't seem true to me, because there's a lot of people who are traumatized, and they don't all become extremists. In fact, most of them don't. And so I want to know what the real reason was. And one of the interesting things that I found about the extremists in Luton was that they were not poor people. They were not they're not even working class. They were middle class. They were well to do. They were well educated. They had been given pretty much everything that anybody could be expected to have in the UK. They were not immigrants either. They were second generation. And they had a lot of them sort of were highly intelligent. They worked as medical students, or they were working in architecture or engineering. So these were highly educated people. They had no problems with money. They had completely comfortable lives, right? So there was no trauma. There was no poor education. There was no poverty involved. These were normal people. In fact, they were above average in wealth. They were above average in education. And so I realized that all of the traditional explanations that were particularly being given by the left were wrong about Islamic extremism. And I actually realized that a lot of it really just stemmed to boredom. A lot of these guys were bored, and they wanted to belong to something. They wanted to go out there and do something crazy because it excited them, and it filled them with this sense of adventure, and it also gave them a sense of belonging to something greater than what they'd been perhaps given. So while they were not alienated from society, they did seek more belonging to something, some grand project that they could be part of. And so this was a big insight for me, because what I realized was that you could give people the best education. You could give them everything that they want. You could give them a good house. You could give them, nice job. You could give them all the things that people expect to get from society. And some people will still rebel against all of that, and they will still just try to kill people, try to blow things up. As that famous line from, I think it's from The Dark Knight. Some people just want to watch the world burn, no matter what. And this was a big eye opener for me, because I realized that the problems they're not environmental problems. These are problems that come from personality, which is something that is very controversial for a lot of people, because there's this idea, a very popular idea in the social sciences, which is that people only do bad things because bad things happen to them. Again, going back to trauma, there's always, like, because the social sciences lean left politically, there's a focus on the environment as a cause for why people do what they do. And this is because it fits with the left-wing worldview. If problems are as a result of, like, environmental factors, then the left can fix these problems by giving people better environments, and everybody will be equal. The only differences between people are environmental. So all you have to do is fix the environment, and then everybody will be perfectly equal, and you'll have the magical diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it fits in with the sort of standard leftist model, and that's why there's a lot of pushback to this idea that it's actually got a lot to do with personality. Personality is a big reason why people become extreme, and this is also shown in crime figures as well. When you look at crime, you see that it's actually a small number of people, a very small number of people, who commit the vast majority of crime. So we say that crime is Pareto. It's Pareto distributed, which means roughly, around 20% of criminals commit 80% of crime. So if this was environmental, this wouldn't make any sense, because it's not as if only a tiny proportion of people are in a bad environment. If you look at things like poverty, if you look at things like people being abused as children, these are actually surprisingly common things. These are not rare events. These are actually quite common. Trauma is very common. Everybody is traumatized in their childhood in some way or another. They're bullied at school, or they have some sort of illness, or some of the problem in their life. So pretty much everybody encounters trauma of some kind in their life. So if the idea that people commit crime or terrorism because they're traumatized was true, we would expect a lot more of an even distribution of crime and terrorism. We would see a lot more of it, but we don't. We see it's actually very rare. And this tells us that it's actually a very specific and very unique set of circumstances that lead people to commit crime or terrorism or whatever. And so this is an inconvenient truth that a lot of people in the social sciences don't really want to grapple with. But again, this was, something that I realized was a real problem, because if the social sciences are not willing to understand the true causes of why people become criminals or terrorists or whatever, they're not going to fix the problem. And this is something that seems to not really concern a lot of people in the social sciences. They're more interested in this project that they have of trying to promote their political causes, their activism. So this was what brought me onto another form of extremism, which is wokeism, which I rebelled against, and I found quite interesting to study, because what I realized is I got a lot of pushback from a lot of crime and terrorism researchers when they read my work, because I published some work with the Quilliam Foundation, which was advising the government on Islamic extremism, and that sort of got my work into the sort of lap of a lot of terrorism researchers, academics, and I got a bit of pushback from them, in which they were saying that I was simplifying the issue, and that environment does play a part and all this sort of stuff. And I haven't denied that environment plays no part. I'm not saying that environment plays no part. Of course, it plays some part, but it's not the main reason why people become extreme or why they commit crime. And I realized with the pushback that I got that a lot of things about my work was being sort of discounted because it didn't fit the right politics. And again, it's crazy, because if you look at what ISIS themselves have said, ISIS had a magazine which they used to publish monthly, which was called Dabiq. And in this magazine, they actually explained their reasons for why they hate the West, why they're fighting the West. And it's got nothing to do with foreign policy. They say themselves, it's not because of foreign policy. It's not because of, neo-colonialism or whatever. It's none of that stuff, right? Like the reason that they hate the West is simply because the West are not Muslim. That's it, right? They don't have any deeper reason for it. Like in their worldview, people are either good people or they're infidels. There's no in between. Either they're good Muslims or they're infidels. There's no such thing as somebody who's, a bad Muslim. If you're a bad Muslim, you're not a Muslim. And if you're not a Muslim, then you don't have rights under their ideology. And again, if you look at the people that went to join ISIS, these are not alienated people. These are not people who come from the bottom rungs of society. A lot of these people were quite rich. A lot of them were engineers, doctors, or medical students. So these are not people that were rejected from society. These are people who were given the best education, living standards that they could have hoped for, and they still rebelled. And so it was literally just trying to sort of get people to understand this. And the pushback that I got from a lot of academics was that I was being Islamophobic, racist, even, I've got people calling me racist, even though, I'm the same ethnicity as the people that that I'm writing about. They still call me racist, And so I kind of realized that there's another form of extremism. I realized that there's another form of extremism, which was not as overtly violent as the Islamic extremism, but which is probably more dangerous, because it's got a lot of power, a lot of institutional power, a lot of cultural power. And so I sort of started writing about wokeism, because of the kind of reactions I was getting. And so, yeah, that led me into a whole new can of worms.
If you're a fan of dystopian fiction and sci-fi thrillers, then you should check out Lucid, a new novel by writer Michael S. Milano. Lucid is a 21st century blend of 1984 and Brave New World, set during a devastating pandemic. The year is 2084, and the Pansophical Corporation protects what's left of humanity from the deadly Timbuktu virus and a terrorist organization known as Praxis. After losing his wife to the pandemic and being assaulted by public safety for violating curfew, citizen Anthony Sartori begins to have bizarre flashbacks. In a culture dominated by suspicion, asking the wrong questions could put him in the crosshairs, but Anthony is determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Lucid is an exciting and timely read that cautions against collectivism, technological surveillance, and sacrificing freedom for the illusion of safety. If that's up your alley, go to lucidthebook.com and grab yourself a copy today. That's LUCID, thebook.com to get yourself a copy. Free to be safe, safe to be free. LucidTheBook.com. Man, you've said so many interesting things here. I mean, it's interesting. You talked about the Pareto distribution of criminality, and it's not even in that case. It's not even 20/80. I mean, if you look at the
It's less. Yeah,
results
it's less.
of,
Yeah,
I'm sure
yeah,
it's more like 199.
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Well, yeah. When you look at
El Salvador has quite literally run this experiment where
yeah,
they jailed 1% of their population, and
yeah.
their homicide rate has dropped by 99%.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when it comes to sort of repeat offenders, they are a tiny, tiny proportion, around 1%. Yeah. So, and when you include severe, like violent crimes, it's even smaller. So violent crime repeat offenders are a very, very sort of tiny proportion of people. And it's interesting because if you actually just stop repeat offending, if you give repeat offenders a longer sentence, you do drastically reduce crime. And again, this would make life much easier for so many people, but it's because it's deemed somewhat politically inconvenient to the narrative, the dominant narrative, that it doesn't really get addressed. Instead, there's a focus on trying to um, improve things like education or social integration. These things don't work. They're not the reason. Again, the people that I saw in Luton that were becoming extreme, they were not alienated people. They were socially integrated. They were some of the most integrated people in that town. you know, and so people are really going by the wrong things. It is ultimately, it comes down to personality, and there is, interestingly, I mean, dark triad traits are a big part of it. So, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and well, there's actually, it's not dark triad, it's actually dark tetrad, because there's actually two other forms as well. I've forgotten. There's Machiavellianism, psychopathy. What's the other one? I've forgotten the other one. Memory's a bit frazzled at
Narcissism
the
and
moment, a bit
sadism.
jet lagged. But narcissism, sadism, perfect, great. So glad I got you. Yeah. So so those are the four. So basically, those tend to be quite highly correlated with crime, and especially when you combine those with impulsivity, with high emotion. Because it's interesting, because psychopathy on its own doesn't actually predict criminal behavior. This is quite an unusual finding, and a lot of people are surprised when they hear that. But when you actually look at the research, psychopathy is actually pretty neutral. It doesn't really have a big effect on criminality. But when you combine psychopathy with impulsivity, suddenly you get a massive spike in the correlation. And it's because a lot of crime is really due to first order thinking. It's due to people reacting impulsively and thinking with their emotions rather than with their reason. So they go out there and they just do something because they feel something strongly, but they don't think it through. They don't think about the consequences of their actions. And so when you combine that impulsivity with the other dark tetrad traits, it does lead to a massive spike in criminality. And unfortunately, there's not much you can really do um, at a societal level to combat impulsivity, other than just maybe giving people tools that they can help them philosophically. So maybe stoicism would be a good one, to teach people to sort of take a step back from their emotions and to sort of objectively analyze what they're doing. Because when you can get to people to slow down their decision making, you can actually reduce impulsivity that way. You could get people to not be so tyrannized by their emotions, so that they're less of a puppet to reactions, and they're actually thinking before they react. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't seem to have much interest in stoicism, because it's quite a, when you tell people it's Greek mythology, I'm sorry, Greek mythology, when you tell people it's Greek philosophy, that probably turns them off. But cognitive behavioral therapy is very similar to stoicism, and this has been used to great effect. In fact, when you look in the field of psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most robust forms of intervention that you can get. It's as good as even the best psychological drugs, which is unusual when you consider that it's just talking therapy. It's literally just talking to people, and yet it has an effect size which is similar to that of the best drugs that you can give people for like antipsychotic medication and all that sort of stuff. So I'm a big fan of CBT. I think it helps people a lot, and it's been proven throughout history to be extremely robust. It helps people a lot. One of the things that it does is it allows people to sort of internalize their locus of control, and this is a big problem of people, I think, especially in the digital age. Is I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, but he's written this good piece about, along with another psychologist called Jean Twenge, in which they talk about the gradual externalization of the locus of control. So this fits in with the idea of blaming people's actions on their environment. So for your listeners, the locus of control marks the degree to which you believe your destiny is determined by your actions or by your environment. So if you have an internal locus of control, you believe that your destiny is shaped by your actions, that you control your destiny. If you have an external locus of control, then you believe that nothing you do is going to affect your destiny, that you're essentially a puppet of your environment. And one of the reasons why I rebel against this idea that people become criminals because of their environment is because it externalizes people's locus of control. If you teach people that the reason why they are behaving the way they're behaving is because of some unresolved trauma, what you're saying is that they don't have any power over their own lives. You're saying that they're a slave to their circumstances. And I think this is bad for people generally. It's just psychologically a bad thing to do, because when you don't believe you have control, then you don't. You lose control. You stop caring about improving yourself. You start resigning yourself to fate. You start thinking, well, what's the point what's the point in trying to better myself, because I was born with a lousy hand. So that's it. That's my fate. I can't do anything about it. And this extends to all avenues of life. You see it everywhere. You see people being blamed, like, life. If somebody doesn't get a job, or if they're poor, that gets blamed on systemic racism or the patriarchy, or whatever. When you blame these things on external circumstances, what you're doing is you're telling these people that they have no power. You're telling them that, oh well, it doesn't matter how much you try, because the system is always going to keep you down. The patriarchy will always keep you down, or systemic racism will keep you down, or capitalism will keep you down. So there's no point in trying. This has been proven by many, many studies to be bad for people. When you externalize the locus of control, you make people more depressed, you make them less proactive, you give them less agency, you just deteriorate the quality of their life. Even health outcomes are affected by locus of control, or at least there's a correlation. I won't say that one causes the other, but there's a strong correlation between good health and internal locus of control. So if you believe you are in control of your actions, you're going to be more healthy, you'll be eating healthier, you're less likely to be addicted to drugs, you're more likely to work out regularly, get good exercise. All of these things are correlated with an internal locus of control. And you could say that maybe these two things are confounded by a third variable, which would be something like conscientiousness. So one of the big 5 personality traits is conscientiousness. And we know that conservatives tend to be more conscientious. Conscientiousness in the sort of context of the big 5 personality traits is basically the degree to which you have agency and you take control of your life. So, you show up and you do things. You don't need people to push you around to do things. You do them yourself. So proactivity. This is strongly correlated with both internal locus of control and good health, and also good psychological health as well. That's a very important part of it. So people who have internal locus of control, in study after study after study, it shows that they have much healthier lives. And this is why, when you look at the health outcomes between liberals and conservatives, again, this has been studied in depth. This shows that there's a strong difference between liberals and conservatives in mental health, especially when you look at women. So you look at liberal women, and liberal women's mental health has really, really drastically deteriorated over the past 10 years. Since the advent of social media, there's been a big rise in the number of women who are seeing psychiatrists for mental health issues and being diagnosed with mental health issues too. It's interesting because women generally do tend to have higher rates of mental illness than men. But what's crazier is that when you control for political ideology, because women are more liberal than men, when you control for political ideology, you find that conservative women actually have lower rates of mental illness than liberal men. So it flips the gender thing, like when you account for political ideology. So that's a stronger. So what's a stronger predictor than gender of mental illness is your political persuasion. Conservatives have much lower rates of mental illness than liberals, and I think personally that the reason for this is because conservatives tend to have an internal locus of control. They take control of their lives. They if they have a problem, they blame themselves and they take action accordingly. They don't blame their problem on some external thing which they have no control over. So they don't have that sense of powerlessness that liberals have. Because I think one of the issues with liberals is because they blame so many problems on the system, on things going on outside of their control, it makes them feel powerless. And this can cause depression, it can cause anxiety, it can lead to even higher neuroticism, which is bad for liberals because liberals already tend to score higher on neuroticism, and women tend to score higher on neuroticism than men. So it amplifies the neuroticism. It makes them feel even more nervous, even more anxious. And so this is, I think, a big reason for why so many people feel bad, and this is why I think we need to stop blaming things like crime on trauma. I just think that blaming anything, in fact, not just crime, but anything, blaming anything on trauma actually traumatizes people in a weird way. It traumatizes their mind. It makes them feel powerless. And so I'm trying to empower people by using this psychological research now to show people that actually, no, it's not the trauma. It's how you look at the world. That's what's causing the issues.
Yeah, you've said a lot there, man.
Yeah, sorry, I went off
Yeah,
on a bit of
there
a
are.
tangent.
No, it's all good. I think there are. I mean, I'm aware of a lot of the things that you were saying. I think beyond locus of control, I can think of many other obvious, at least to me, reasons why conservatives are not just happier but more mentally stable than liberals, especially in this day and age. And I would say one of the big ones is that conservatives are more grounded in reality. I would argue that
Yeah,
they
yeah,
always
it's
have been, and
yeah.
I would say especially now. I mean, if you've been a liberal for the past 10 to 15 years and you're meant to go with the party line, then you have been forced to deny or at least pretend to deny many aspects of reality for a pretty long time, down to the basic things of, what is a man, what is a woman? If you are a quote unquote good liberal and you're supposed to go with the party line, you're suddenly, as of about 10 years ago, supposed to be living in this permanent false reality where you're just constantly denying the things that your eyes can see and the things that your ears can hear in order to fit in. And I think that constant denying of reality is something that can drive someone mad because it's like you're literally not rooted in reality anymore once you're talking about men getting pregnant and women having penises and men being in women's sports and all of these other ideas, not just that's like the most obvious one, but so many of the ideas that they have, from border policy to what you've touched on about with crime, like all of these narratives are just increasingly detached from reality. I think if you were to go back perhaps 50 or 60 years ago, even if it would go back 20 or 30 years ago, I would say I've never been a liberal and I don't think I ever will be, but the notions that they were saying were more rooted in reality, even if I may disagree with them. And I just think for the past 10 years, it's just gone off a cliff. And then you add social media, and then you add the fact that they're probably less likely to have strong familial bonds. They're less likely to be religious. Religious people are happier. That's even proven by secular studies. And again, it's something that's just obvious to me that that would be the case. You've already touched on the fact that conservatives are healthier physically, which is going to impact them mentally. So, with all these things compounded, it's of no surprise to me whatsoever that a huge chunk of liberal people, especially women, because they're getting slammed with even more of these narratives, and they're already more neurotic. Yeah, it sounds like a perfect recipe to to make people mentally unstable at best.
Yeah, it's a strange sort of phenomenon that we've seen with the left, sort of being taken over by this sort of pseudo-scientific worldview. It's quite interesting because I would have regarded the right as being more pseudo-scientific back in the day. When I was young, sort of with the sort of focus on creationism, denial of evolution. But now you've got denial of evolution baked into sort of the left. A lot of, like, if you look at the 20th century, it was I saw mainly sort of right wingers who were the more sort of anti-science of the two political persuasions. And since then, it's really shifted. Now you see like more sort of support for actual evolution on the right than on the left. Like, I think one of the things that sort of has really affected the left, I think, has been this blank slateism. I think it's a real problem, and it sort of explains their issues about pretty much everything. I think in the 20th century, the disagreement, at least the main disagreement between the left and the right, was on economics. So you had socialism versus capitalism. That was the main thing. But I think with the failure of socialism and communism especially, I think the left had to find something else to sort of root for. And so they sort of went into this other sort of weird worldview, which is blank slateism, which is this idea that nobody has any inherent qualities, that we're all blank slates, and that everything that happens in our lives, or everything that we do, is due to culture. So this fits in with the idea of sort of the whole trans thing. So nobody's born a man or a woman. You're assigned a man or a woman at birth, and it fits in with pretty much every sort of aspect of life. So the only reason somebody becomes rich is not because they have inbuilt ability to be rich. It's not because they worked hard, because they have a conscientious personality, or it's not because they have a high IQ. It's just luck, basically, because we're all the same. We're all fundamentally the same. And the only reason some people get ahead and others don't is that some people are lucky, or some people are greedy. And so, it just doesn't explain anything. And what I use as a sort of testament for whether something is true or not is how much predictive power it gives somebody. Like, can you make good predictions with this idea, and can you do it consistently? The more you can predict something based on an idea, the more likely that thing is to be true. The thing with a lot of the modern leftist view on evolution is that it just doesn't predict anything. It doesn't make any good predictions about why things happen. Whereas when you look at evolution, straight away you can make huge numbers of predictions about our current problems. And it's weird because this is affected, like, a lot of people who should know better. A lot of biologists, a lot of psychologists. If you look at the actual fields of academia where a lot of this research is taking place, they're overwhelmingly left wing. And it's crazy because these are the people that should be the most knowledgeable about these issues, and yet you have people who don't even have a basic education in biology who now have a better grasp of biology, at least of the basics of biology, than these people. And the way I attribute this, the reason why I believe this has happened, is because these people are smart. Because the fact is that even though conservatives may be healthier and happier than liberals, by pretty much every metric, liberals are smarter than conservatives overall, on average. Doesn't mean that every liberal is smarter than every conservative.
Hard disagree, but carry on.
Well, this is based on research. I mean, I found it hard to, and it's based on not just on.
If you said better educated, I'd agree with you. But if you're saying actual intelligence,
well,
I'm not convinced.
Yeah, I mean, if you measure it by salary, if you measure it by IQ, if you measure it by education, all of these metrics, liberals beat conservatives on average. I'm talking about averages here, so I'm not saying that that every conservative. I think that with conservatives, it's like that midwit meme. So you have a lot of. I think with liberals, they tend to be more towards the midwit sort of thing. Yeah. With conservatives, you either get extremely low IQ people or extremely high IQ people with conservatives. And I think that the low IQ people in the conservative movement sort of push the average down quite a bit. So when you look at averages, you do find that the average liberal is smarter according to various metrics, not just one metric.
This is very interesting, actually, because I would actually argue that even if you could show that the thing were true for IQ, I don't think that IQ and smartness are the same thing. if you're telling me that a man can get pregnant, then I don't think you're smart.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think the way I sort of define
like, like, like
intelligence.
common sense to me matters like a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. No, I agree with you on
And
that.
if your
But
life outcomes are, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, but that's the thing. Even life outcomes for liberals tend to be better overall, like in terms of salary at least. I'm not saying that liberals are, unanimously better than conservatives in life, but when it comes to sort of things like salary as well, liberals tend to earn more than conservatives on average.
What about everything else? Why are we going with just salary?
Well, the salary is one, then there's IQ as well. IQ, liberals score higher on average on IQ, and then also education as well. Liberals tend to be more educated than conservatives on average. So just looking at just these metrics, if we define smartness or intelligence by those metrics, then the evidence is pretty good that the average liberal is smarter than the average conservative by that definition of smart. Um, so the way I sort of look at this is that, again, going back to what you were just saying, where you said you don't believe that somebody who believes a man can become a woman is smart. This is very interesting because I agree with you on that, right? But I think that it's actually because they're smart that they allow themselves to believe this, right? Because it requires a lot of mental gymnastics to believe
Mm-hmm.
that a man can become a woman by thinking about it, just by daydreaming that they're a woman, a man can become a woman, right? That's like an ordinary person could not convince themselves that is true. To do that, you need to engage in incredible mental gymnastics. You need to be able to rationalize at a level that most people are not capable of.
I think I know the term. I think I'd say intellectual.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough.
I think you could. I think we're conflating intellectualism with intelligence or smartness, and I don't think they're the same.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. But again, bear in mind, I'm only talking about averages here. I'm not saying that
I
the
know, I know, I
smartest.
know. I'm a smart guy. I know how averages work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I would say that probably smart conservatives are probably at parity, if not higher than smart liberals. So when you get the cream, the elite of conservatives, they can hold their own against the extreme elite of the liberals. So I think it's just that when you look at like the demographics, you tend to sort of have large numbers of lower IQ people in the conservative movement rather than in the liberal movement, and that sort of pushes the average down. But yeah, I mean, I think it's because a lot of these academics are intelligent overall in terms of raw IQ that they're able to form these mental gymnastics. They're able to rationalize themselves into beliefs that ordinary people couldn't. They can come up with really, really convoluted, very complicated, and often very sophisticated explanations for why a man can become a woman. If you actually have a look at, I mean, I'm sure you have, but if you look at some of their reasoning is clever. It's not necessarily good reasoning, but it's clever and cunning in the sense that it employs sophisticated forms of rationalization. And I've written about this. I have an article called "Why Smart People Believe Stupid Things," which goes into this in detail. And it shows, there's a lot of evidence. Again, multiple studies have found that smart people are actually more biased than unsmart people or unintelligent people. And this is because smart people are able to rationalize much, much better. Being good at reasoning makes them better at rationalizing. So they are able to sort of convince themselves of things that they want to believe rather than things that are actually true. Somebody who doesn't have much brain power is not going to be able to convince themselves that a man can become a woman. It's just not. They don't have the imagination. They don't have the sort of mental gymnastics, the rationalizing faculties for it, and so they are stuck with common sense. Somebody who has a huge amount of imagination and who can pick and choose information in ways that sort of support certain narratives, they can delude themselves much better. And I think that's why a lot of academics end up believing crazy things about biology because they are able to convince themselves of things that they want to believe rather than things that are actually true.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting. I think this is such an interesting conversation because, I'm an Oxford University graduate myself, right? So from the sort of ivory tower ways of measuring, IQ or intelligence or whatever, I could kind of play that game. But for me, when I look at the world and I travel it and I just meet so many people offline and online, I've started to much more parse out the concepts of IQ, wisdom, and let's say smartness, because I think they kind of get lumped together, and IQ is kind of used as this kind of like catch all for it. And I just don't think it's accurate because, as you're aware, there are people who might be mid to low IQ, but in terms of actually navigating the world and drawing conclusions, they're a lot smarter, or at least a lot wiser than some other people who on paper might be way more educated, right? There are people who have PhDs, they're technically, doctors, and they're complete idiots, right? They might have a high IQ, but when it comes to when it comes to common sense, when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to actually like things that are tangible in the real world, like they're morons. And then you can have someone else who has very little education and might not have the fastest processor up there in their brain, but they're very wise. They're very good at decision making. They're very good at just sort of just understanding things in a way that's not overly intellectualized. So I think that intellect and I mean, it is interesting because intellect is actually one of the big five personality traits, right? Kind of with consciousness. So I don't know if it's really correlated per se with intelligent quotient. I think there are two different things. Intellect is ability to think of abstract ideas and think on a certain level, as you were describing, right? It takes a certain level of intellect and sophistication to understand the transgenderism concepts. Um, but I think that's a different dimension to you kind of get what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, completely agree with what you're saying. I think, well, the first thing is intelligence is distinct from the big five personality traits. They're very different things, but the big five personality traits do mediate intelligence, and this goes to what you're saying about things like wisdom. And certain people are much better at acquiring wisdom, even if they have maybe lower IQ, because they're more able to confront reality. So conscientiousness, and somebody who has low neuroticism would be a lot more bolder, a lot less cowardly with regard to the truth. Whereas somebody who's high in neuroticism, even if they have a high IQ, they're going to be afraid of certain facts, and that's going to, they're going to want to be comfortable rather than accurate, and so they'll lie to themselves, and they can deceive themselves into beliefs that are not true. Whereas somebody who has lower neuroticism,
And they want to fit in more.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, neuroticism is sort of correlated with conformity. Like highly neurotic people tend to be more conformist overall. And so if you're lower in neuroticism, you tend to not care what people think as much. And so you'll just think what you think is true rather than what you think people want you to believe. And this is, I think, this is a powerful mediator of IQ. This can compensate for having a low IQ. If you're just somebody who just wants to believe what's true, if you're curious and if you're humble, these are things that can mediate IQ also. If you're, for example, I would say that somebody like Nicholas Nassim Taleb, he's probably got a high raw IQ. He's clearly got a high raw IQ. He's pretty good with maths, but he says a lot of really stupid shit. And it's not because he's stupid. He's not a stupid guy. It's because he's extremely arrogant. He believes that he has all of the answers. He believes that there's nothing that he doesn't understand. And so this overconfidence causes him to trip up routinely. It causes him to say things that are not true. And then when he gets proved wrong, then he doubles down. He doesn't want to show that he's wrong. So he moves the goalposts. He just digs himself deeper into delusion because he's so afraid of being wrong. And so personality traits can make people stupid. It's not just IQ. So I completely agree with you on that. IQ is really just your raw reasoning abilities. That's all it is. It's your raw ability to infer one thing from another. That's literally all IQ really is. But that is only a small component of things like wisdom, knowledge, intelligence. All of these things are much vaster, and there's so many more things like personality. I'm a big proponent of the idea that personality is a big sort of determinant of intelligence. So somebody who has a lower raw IQ, but who is humble and who is curious and who's willing to change their mind when they're wrong, that kind of person is going to learn wisdom at a much, much higher rate than somebody who has a high IQ, but who believes that they're always right. They're not willing to change their mind. They're arrogant in their beliefs. They're neurotic, so they're afraid of the truth. all of these qualities can make a high IQ people stupid. So yeah, this is one of the reasons why I think, despite having a higher IQ on average, liberals tend to sway towards a lot of these kinds of sophisticated delusions that you see in academia. Yeah.
Hmm. Why? Here's a question. Why do you think it is that in the modern West, so much of the mainstream sociocultural and political conversation and debate has, over the decades, it seems to have moved away from common sense? Because there were so many things you were saying earlier on when we were talking about, for example, discussing crime, right? The concept that if someone is a rampant, violent criminal, I mean, in the past, every society knew how to deal with such people. Okay, there wasn't a huge debate and needing 5 million studies to see, okay, how do we deal with someone who keeps running around assaulting, stealing, murdering people? It's like, okay, either you just execute them or you put them in prison and you do not let them out. However, it seems in the West in particular, I would argue that the complete abolishment of the death penalty, I think in every Western country now except the USA, is actually an indication of this, regardless of what someone may feel on that particular issue. But it just seems like there's been an increasing detachment as people have become more, quote unquote, educated and supposedly more sophisticated, and things have become a lot more cerebral, and everyone wants to study to understand the most basic things. There's been this gravitation away. There's been this pull away from just common sense. I mean, in the past, of course, I'm not trying to look at history with some rose tinted glasses, right? Because there are a lot of things that obviously are a lot better now than they were 100, 200, 500 years ago. But it seems like there are also things where there are the things where we've moved closer to reality and closer to the truth. And then there are also big areas where it seems like things have just moved away from that. You could even argue, talks about family dynamics and the importance of children having their parents and being raised, and the importance of fathers and the importance of mothers, and even the importance of having children itself, and the community and families, like all of these things that are quite commonsensical. The concept that if you eat too much rub, rubbish food, then you're going to get fatter, and if like all of these ideas that are very simple, it just seems like there's been a move away from a lot of them. And I don't know the perfect way to word it, but there seems to be declining common sense with the rise of, I wouldn't even say science, I'd say scientism, perhaps, and an over reliance on studies, and almost people not being willing to acknowledge, let alone say, what is obviously true. I don't quite know what's going on there, because in most of the world doesn't suffer this problem. I live in the Middle East. This is not an issue here, but in Western countries, UK, USA, Canada for sure, Australia, parts of Western Europe, I don't know. It's like they just keep tripping up over their own intellectualism and liberalism.
Yeah, so I would attribute this to what I call information overload.
Mm,
So I think life has become more and more abstract in that it's become more and more divorced from reality. In the old days, you had to confront reality every day, like because let's say if you're living 1,000 years ago, the only way you're going to eat is if you go out there onto the farm and you reap the wheat and you harvest the food and you slaughter the cow, whatever yourself, right? You had to grapple with reality physically, and you're constantly sort of engaging in reality in your life. What has happened is that since the Industrial Revolution, more and more of our work is done in our brains rather than with our bodies. So we've now got office jobs. We've got people who live their entire lives indoors, pretty much, like on their computers. People working virtually. Even people don't even have to go to office anymore. People can work remotely from their computer. And gradually, what's happened is with every development in technology, we've become more and more divorced from our physical reality. We now spend more and more time in these bubbles in our minds, essentially, in cyberspace, and less of our lives in the physical world. And what happens is that when we enter this virtual world, this cyberspace, we're not just confronted with facts like we are in reality. If you go out there in reality, you're just confronted with fact after fact after fact. If you drop a ball, it's going to hit the ground. Simple things like that. In the virtual world, there are no, it's not guaranteed that you're just going to be seeing facts. There's a lot of fiction as well. And there's also just a lot of information generally, right? There's an overload of information. You're surrounded, you're basically living in a universe of information. And the way I would say it's like the constellations in the sky, right? When you look at the constellations, you can see any pattern you want, right? The ancient Greeks would draw lines between stars. These lines are purely arbitrary, by the way. They have no astronomical validity. It's not like the stars that are grouped together actually belong together. They're not in closer proximity than other stars. They're just purely arbitrary. Somebody decided one day to draw a line between that star, and he created a shape. And it's much like what happens when we go online and we're in this world of sort of virtual information. We have so many data points now that we can draw any line that we want between any two data points to create any narrative that we want, right? We can create any shape, any mythology that we want. So, like the ancient Greeks, they drew Perseus in the sky, they drew, Leo or Sagittarius or whatever. We can create our own narratives. We can create our own mythologies. We just have to just cherry pick whatever data we like in this world of infinite ideas. We can pick and choose facts we like. We can ignore facts we don't like. And we can create any narrative we want. And so what's happened is that with the information age, what's happened is there's been a fragmentation of culture. There's no longer a single narrative that's being propagated through society. If you look at pre-digital revolution, you look at when people were living around in the beginning of the 20th century, they had a TV set, maybe, yes. But through that TV set, they were given usually 1, 2, maybe 3 narratives, right? And that was it. That was the narrative. There was no other competing narrative. If you go even further back, you had really, just a few different mythologies. If you look at Christian Europe, in any one place, you usually only had one narrative, which was the Christian narrative or whatever. Everybody was getting all of that information from the same book. Now, there is no centralized narrative. There is no thing uniting everybody together. Now everybody's living in their own subcultures because they're choosing these sort of data points and they're drawing these lines like constellations between these data points to create their own narrative constellations. And as a result, nobody's on the same page. There's no centralized culture keeping everybody together. And this has led to fragmentation. It's led to alienation to a certain extent. But when you can believe anything you want, why believe the truth? That's how it is for a lot of people. All I have to do, if I want to believe that all my problems are the result of the patriarchy, all I have to do is type in patriarchy into Google, right? And I can just get an infinite amount of information about that is supporting my view. If I want to believe that, let's just take the opposite example. If I want to say that women are the problem, if I want to say that the longhouse is the reason for everybody's problems, I can just go on to Google. I can type in the longhouse. I'll get a lot of right-wing information, which will fit my narrative. So it's like whatever you believe, whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, whether you're an Islamist, whether you're an atheist, Christian, whatever you believe, you can find an infinite amount of information that supports your narrative. And so everybody can just dig themselves deeper and deeper into their own delusion, whatever delusion they may have. And as a result of that, combined with the fact that we're not embracing reality anymore, we're living in this virtual world where most of our interactions occur via screens, like I'm interacting with you now. A lot of this combines to sort of delude people more and more to, we always thought that virtual reality was going to be us wearing these headsets and navigating through these sort of like, computer generated worlds. But the real virtual reality is just what we have now, which is spending most of our lives interacting with people and ideas online. So I think that's the explanation for it.
I mean, where do you think this leads humanity? We're coming towards the end of the first quarter of a new century. And in our relatively short lifetimes, we have seen a crazy amount of changes. I mean, the amount of changes that have happened technologically, I'd say socially, culturally, politically, in a relatively short number of decades, it blows my mind when I honestly think about it. So when I think towards the next 25, 50, 100 years, I mean, do you just see increased fragmentation going on? Do you think that this is going to just continue to accelerate? Is there going to be something that will bring people back and unite us? We hear so much talk about division and polarization. Where do you think it's going to go?
In my ideal situation, there would be a backlash against where things are going. People will just stop, spending so much time on social media, and that will actually start going out. And the new counterculture will be going out in the real world and meeting people in the real world. That would be the ideal situation, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is, I don't know if you're familiar with the story The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Well, in this story, basically, it's about a guy who goes into the future. He travels far, far into the future. And what's happened in the far future is that humanity has evolved into two subspecies, the Eloi and the Morlocks. And the Morlocks basically live underground, and they spend their lives working physically, doing a lot of labor and building things and all that. And the Eloi, they live on the surface, and they have everything done for them by the Morlocks. And as a result of this, as a result of sort of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of having things done for them, they've lost all of their abilities. Their brains have atrophied, their bodies have atrophied. They're the brains and bodies of children, because they've never had to use their physical bodies. They've never had to use their brains. Having everything done for them has weakened them to the point that they're now helpless. And in the story, basically, it's implied that the Morlocks will eat the Eloi. And I think that something similar could await humanity in the long term, where, because you now have AI, which is essentially going to be able to do pretty much every mental task that humans can do, from like sort of mathematical work to writing to art, all of this stuff can be done by AI now. So if you consider, we're on the horizon of AI agents, and AI agents are basically they are chatbots that can use the internet for you, that can book flights for you, that can browse the net for you, search stuff for you, do research. They can actually do more than just a normal language model can do. And a lot of people are already starting to outsource their cognition to machines. And I think that a lot of people are going to do this because it's going to be anti-competitive to not do it. Like, people who do this are going to have an edge over people who don't. And so there's going to be a race towards automation of our mental faculties, and a lot of people are going to be increasingly depending on AI to do things for them. If the worst scenario plays out, which I hope it doesn't, but if it does, the worst scenario is that over a long, long period of time, people will gradually lose their mental faculties because they'll be outsourcing their cognition to machines. And the brain is a muscle in a sense. It's not technically a muscle, but it behaves like a muscle in that if you don't use it, you lose it. And so if you are outsourcing all of your faculties to a machine, over time, you're going to become less able to think. You're going to be less able to write. You're going to be less able to do anything other than to outsource. You're going to become an outsourcing machine. I think that what this is going to do is this is going to lead to a lot of people losing their abilities and being dependent on, not just on the machines, but on the people who create the machines. And there's going to be some people out there, I think, who will retain their agency, who will only use machines for things that they couldn't do themselves, but will actually try to, they'll be interested in self-improvement. I think this might be maybe people who are more on the conservative side of things, who will be less embracing of new technology, and will tend to sort of focus on getting back to basics. I think there's going to be a large movement on the conservative side of things of people that are going to be trying to go paleo. They'll be trying to sort of move away from technology and will try to live a more simpler life. And I think that those people, they'll have a disadvantage in the near future, but they'll probably have an advantage in the far future because they will retain their abilities where everybody else has become dependent on machines. And so it's going to be interesting to see where this dynamic between these two groups will go. You know, you'll have one group which probably will be a lot more interested in thinking for themselves and doing things physically, health conscious people. And then you'll have a lot of other people who will be basically outsourcing everything to machines. You'll also probably have a third group of people that are going to be even worse off. And they will be the people that just completely passive in their lives, that are just completely lost in worlds of entertainment, who are just completely living their lives reactively rather than proactively. I think that this is going to be the dividing line between the people in the future: people who live proactively, people who do things themselves, who retain their agency, and people who live reactively, people whose entire lives are just a series of reflex reactions to whatever stimulus they're receiving from their screens or from their prompts. You know, so we're prompting AI now, but AI in the future will be prompting us. So I think there's going to be this split in humanity, and I don't know where that's going to lead, but it's quite a scary prospect.
Yeah, you said a concept that I've spoken about on multiple podcasts. Actually, when I think about this century that we're living in, I have used the term bifurcation a lot. In that, I think that humanity is going to bifurcate in a way that we've just never seen before. I think in multiple ways. I think there's the obvious technological aspect of it, but I think even with that, it's multi-layered. It's not just AI, it's also robotics and everything that that will entail. I think that's going to impact everything from people's work to economics to relationships, potentially reproduction. I think it's going to have a in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, I think there's going to be a massive bifurcation. I could say that perhaps we're already in the early stage of the mental and physical health bifurcation, and I see that accelerating. I don't see that converging again, at least not in the short term. It does. I'll add another layer to this as well. As you were speaking, I was thinking that something that is actually going to be a significant factor in that bifurcation, although it may not be obvious to all people, is, and it's not going to perfectly split along these lines, but I think there will definitely be a religious versus secular split in terms of the willingness to embrace some of these technologies, in fact. So I think that the people who are, even in my own personal observation, the people who tend to get like really sort of hype and excited about the concept of like putting a chip in their brain or like AI doing everything or whatever, they tend to be more secular. They tend to either be like outright atheists or, you know, maybe they're spiritual but not religious or what, like that. But they don't tend to be traditionally religious, and they obviously with that they tend to be more liberal. And I find that people who are more conservative slash traditionalist, certainly if they follow a more traditional religion, they tend to have much more of an aversion to all of this stuff. Whether that's wanting to live forever or wanting to put a chip in their brain or wanting to outsource everything to AI. I think it's kind of fascinating how, again, it's not, I'm not saying it's a perfect split, but I think that's going to be a heavy element of it all. And you know, I don't have perfect predictive power at all. The world could go in so many directions, and I'm not going to live to see it all. But I'm just so fascinated by what could transpire in this century. I think I don't know. I think people are underthinking it a bit. I don't think people quite realize just how much could potentially change. I think when we think of the future, we all have you know, a now bias, a recency bias, because it's now is what we know. But I think we tend to think, oh, 30 years from now, everything is going to look kind of like it does now, but a little bit different. And I think, I don't know, maybe in a way, I sort of hope it does. But I could imagine 30, 40, 50 years from now, if we were to just kind of get airdropped into 2065 or 2075, we might just be completely confused by what is going on, in the same way that if you took someone from 1970 and you dropped them into 2025, I think first of all, they'd be wondering what these little rectangles that everyone is carrying around and staring into all the time is. They'd be baffled by just so many things, not just what's visible, but just the way people behave, even perhaps the way people dress, cultural and societal attitudes. They'd just be confused by a lot of things, maybe even, demographic changes. That's another big thing that's going to happen this century. If you look at birth rates, I mean, if you extrapolate towards 2100, like the makeup of the world itself is going to look very, very different to what people are used to. How many countries are even going to exist? I think when I was born, there were maybe around 170 or so countries officially recognized. Now we're around 200. Who knows? Is it going to be 1,000 countries? Is it going to be 5,000? Is it going to be, the map is not going to look the same. It might in terms of the land masses, but where those borders are, that's also going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the problems with predicting the future is that the human mind thinks linearly, but technological growth is exponential. So, everything that happens in the future is going to be based on technology that we can't even conceive of. Like you sort of alluded to the sort of idea of, people in, say, like medieval times trying to work out what an iPhone is. If you went back in time to the people in medieval times and try to ask them how things would be in the year 2000 or whatever, 2020, they just wouldn't have any concept of the things that exist today. They wouldn't understand Bitcoin. They wouldn't understand AI. They wouldn't understand pretty much anything, the internet, all of these things that we take for granted. And so, we can only go by what our linear brains are saying and looking at the current course of things, but anything could change the course, like in the future. I've been spending a lot of time trying to work out what kinds of technologies could be created from AI, like what new technologies that we haven't really thought of yet could be created from AI. And I've been thinking about a lot of worrying things, been looking at the way that China's been using drones, for instance, and think that for example, the wars in the future will probably be fought mainly with drones. But if you actually ever look at what the military has been looking at, like things like DARPA, they've been looking at miniaturization of drones. So you'll probably have wars, for example, being fought with armies of robotic mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes could, do crazy stuff. You know what I mean? They could easily wipe out humanity. Like if they just went rogue, you have these tiny nanobots that could kill people by entering their bodies and just screwing things up. And they could self-replicate. There's all this kind of crazy scenarios that lie ahead. But I mean, there's also this idea of artificial wombs as well, which I've been thinking about a lot, which I think is probably going to be eventually used. I think we have big problems with birth rates, at the moment. There's in certain areas like Korea, for example, people are below the replacement rate, which means that their population is going to die out within a few generations. And I can't think of any solution to this other than technology. I mean, there's this idea that maybe if people became more religious, then they would sort of have more children. But there's a few problems with that. The first is that it's hard to make people more religious. You can't actually just tell people to be more religious and then make them, more religious. You can't just disseminate Bibles and hope that people read them. The second thing is that there's no proof that this would even work, because if you actually ever look at countries like Poland has one of the lowest birth rates in Europe, and yet it's also one of the most Christian. So it's not just a simple case of, secularism is leading to low birth rates. This seems to be a problem that's much wider than that. It seems to be a problem partially of education. And even that's not the only problem, because again, it's women who are lacking education. There's a recent study which found that it's actually some of the women that actually have low education that are having the fewest children now. Again, it's not the house prices, because house prices are also not correlated with whether people have children. In fact, it's actually the people who are rich who tend to have fewer children than people who are poor. So all of the existing sort of the things that people believed a few years ago about low birth rates have turned out to not be true. So people don't really have a good answer for why people are not having children. It seems to be that one of the things that I think is maybe the reason is that uh, men are not going out to find women as much because they're losing themselves in video games and they're sort of
Do you know what's interesting?
yeah,
Sorry, Gurwinder. I don't even want to interrupt you, but I think already, we're doing that thing of perhaps over intellectualizing the issue. I think
possibly.
that the thing is this this is one of those issues that would actually be very easy to solve, but it does not fit within the liberal worldview to do what would actually to do what would actually work. To do what would actually work does not fit within the modern liberalized worldview. I mean, if you actually wanted to solve it, you would ban birth control and you would certainly ban abortion. And you would perhaps also fix, do stuff to fix people's hormones because, testosterone is plummeting and women's hormones are getting scrambled. But I mean, that would actually fix it. So I'm not even saying like, yeah, I'm all for banning abortion, by the way. I'm not even advocating banning birth control. But my point is that would actually, if you actually, if people were like dead serious about wanting to fix the issue, then that would fix it. But that concept will make many people, liberals for sure, but even many conservatives, it would make them sort of like real and be like, oh, no, 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 we can't do that. We need to do like, try to tweak all these other knobs. But tweaking all those other knobs, honestly, is not going to do much. Like, it's really not going to do much.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think something like that would work. I mean, like, how would you even
It would
go about
work.
banning?
No, it would work. It would work.
But how could you be
But
sure? I mean,
there's not the political will to do it. Of course it would work. How would it not? People aren't going to
well, the
stop
first
having
thing is
sex.
how would you actually even
People
ban?
are okay.
How would you
Okay,
ban
go ahead.
birth
Sorry.
control? I mean, like I don't know how that would work. Like, how would you do it? Like, because I think if you try to ban something in today's liberal world, it just wouldn't work because people would be able to source birth control from pretty much anywhere. I mean, you can at the absolute worst, you could use the skin of a sausage and put that over your dick and use that as birth control. Do you know what I mean? It's like what I'm trying to say
But
is that
look, if we go back prior to the 1960s,
right,
prior to
the
reliable
prior to
birth
the
control,
sexual
particularly,
revolution, yeah.
yes, if we go pre 1960s, there were 0 countries in the world, as far as I'm aware, that had a major issue with birth rate.
Yeah,
From
I
the
mean,
1960s, it's been massively
yeah,
plummeting. Again,
the pro
I'm just saying that I know people want to have like, oh, we need to look at this and this and this and this, and I'm just like, to me, it's a bit like the crime issue. It's a bit like,
yeah.
okay, yeah, you can tweak this and tweak that and tweak that. And I'm not saying that has 0 impact, but if you really, really wanted to solve the issue, then you've got to do an El Salvador.
Yeah, I mean, it could possibly work in. I think if a country was less liberal and it was more rural, I think it might work. But again, there's no political will, as you pointed out, and there's no logistical way to do it. There's no pragmatic way to actually ban something like that. I mean, you wouldn't be able to get a law like that through Congress or through Parliament. And even if you did, like, it would be very, very hard to enforce a law like that, especially in a world that's globalized like ours. I just don't see it being a viable solution, even if there was a political will for it. So I think, unfortunately, we have to consider, more sort of intellectual sort of solutions. And it's a bit of a scary one because it like all of the things, because I've spoken to quite a lot of people about this, and nobody seems to have a good solution that actually would actually work like in the real world. And there's a lot of ideas in theory. I mean, the idea of artificial wombs is repels a lot of people. It kind of makes me feel uncomfortable.
The thing is, we don't need artificial wombs. Like we genuinely don't. Like the problem is like, look, and I'm not here like moralizing, right? Like if look, if I had been born, if I had been born 50 years before I was, I'm pretty sure I would have at least 4 kids by now. I'm like 99% sure of that. So I myself, someone who is more conservative and who is more religious, is I'm also impacted by the milieu that I grew up in. I'm also impacted by culture, by society, by technology, by things that the world is telling you, by all of these sorts of things. The truth is, the average age of marriage for both men and women and the average age of having a first child has been pushed up by about a decade from a few decades ago. So if people are starting that at, let's say, 30 or even 35, as opposed to 20 or 25, then the results are sort of inevitable, right? Like it's not rocket science. I know you're not supposed to tell women that they have a fertility window, but they do. You know, if you start trying to have kids at 40, it's going to be a lot harder than it would have if you started at 20. We know these things, but again, I think the political correctness and not wanting to suggest this or suggest that. I also think some of the blank slateism plays into this. Um, it sounds like a radical idea to some people, but I don't think it's radical at all. I don't necessarily think that the sort of structure of life of even men and women in general should look identical. I think it would make complete sense. And this is something that, you know, a policy could be done. This is something where incentives could be made that would encourage women to perhaps start a family, make it easier for them to start a family prior to pursuing or completing higher education. Again, knowing that, hey, if you're a man, you know what, you could wait until you're 40 and then you could be like, oh, you know what, I want to start a family now. If you're a woman, it's much, much harder to do that. And we're telling this lie under the name of egalitarianism and blank slateism that, oh no, it's totally fine, right? Men and women can and should pursue the exact same timeline. And as a result, there are millions, the vast majority of people who end up permanently childless, vast majority of them did not want that and did not plan for that, right? A lot of people think that this is happening just because people are voluntarily choosing not to have kids, and that's not the case. The vast majority of people, over 80% of the people who end up permanently, you know, at 50 years old without any kids, they did want to have children, and I think this is sad, by the way. But for all of these reasons, I mean, there's that. Of course, there's infertility as well. I mean, that's now affecting about 1 in 3 couples, and there's many different reasons for that. One of them is age, hormonal disruption, sperm quality. There's a lot of factors going in. I don't know like absolutely everything, but there are a few sort of very obvious ones that I think people want to skirt around. And while the concept of an artificial womb it's certainly interesting technologically, sort of freaks me out, but it's interesting. But it's kind of like, well, what's the problem that we're solving here? It's not like women's wombs have sort of generally stopped working.
Yeah, I think with artificial wombs, I think one of the sort of proposed benefits of those would be that they would allow women to pursue careers whilst also gestating a child. Because you could, if you gestate a child in an artificial womb, then obviously you don't need to take time out from your career or whatever. And so women like who are high flyers or who are really career oriented, they could still have a child, have, you know, they don't have to take 9 months out or whatever to do that. Whether it will work in practice, I don't know, but this is one of the ideas that's proposed. And then also there's the idea that, you know, I think I actually think artificial wombs are going to be a thing regardless of what people think of them, and that even if they're not used by civilians, they will probably be used by the military at some point. Because I think that maybe, you know, when it gets viable to actually create your own human, I think the military are probably going to do this sort of, you know, probably not out in the open, but why would you not? Like, if you want to dominate the world, why would you not create superhumans? You know, there's just literally no, like, if you're someone like China, or you're the sort of DARPA, you know, and you're just interested in taking over the world, which they are, they want to have maximum power. It just makes no sense to not create superhumans like that you can use for whatever ability.
I have a thought on that. Wouldn't it make more sense to use? I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to use robotics or drones? Why would you want to create humans?
You can do both, you know, because obviously there's going to be some things that machines can't do, which is like have true free will, like agency, you know. And there are obviously now, like, I mean, everybody's focused on AI, you know, everybody's talking about robotics and machines, but there's actually been some massive developments in the world of CRISPR, gene editing, and also there has been a lot of development in sort of the creation of artificial wombs, mainly with animals. But as soon as it becomes viable to create um, a superior human, superior in quotes, I just don't see how people would not do that. There's going to be some people out there who will want to do it for whatever reason. If you could create, you know, scientists with super IQs, or even if you just wanted to create like somebody like a wife, create your own wife. In the not talking in the near future. I'm talking in the far future. Do you know what I mean? But think about when it's easy, when it's eventually going to become miniaturized. Everything. One sort of rule of law of technology is that things become miniaturized over time. They become smaller. They become easier to do at home. And I would say maybe in 100 years, so it might be a long time away, but in 100 years, it will be possible to create your own human in your house without using biology, without having sex. So you could actually, on a computer, on a machine, you could probably create your own human. And I think about that and I think, where would that lead? When you can actually create your own human with the qualities that you want them to have, you could actually set the genes, the polygenic sort of structure of their body. You could create that yourself. What would you do with that? That's a very scary thought, but that's going to happen, I think, because again, miniaturization is an iron law of technology. Things become easier over time. They become smaller over time.
Mm.
Eventually, artificial wombs will become small enough that somebody could do them in their basement, and that might be the only solution that we have. I pray it's not, but that might be the only solution we have eventually to procreation, because there's these beautiful ideas out there, but I don't know if any of them will work. There was one idea that I thought of, which would be that I think one of the reasons why people are not having children is that men are just not finding the incentives to not be as good, to actually settle down and start a family, because they're thinking of the short term rather than the long
Yeah,
term.
you're correct. Yeah,
And
you're correct.
yeah, and I think if you could make the incentives better. I mean, one reason why I think the incentives are considered bad is that men consider it a lot of work, and there's a lot of pain in being rejected by a woman. So if you actually go up to a woman, and actually ask her out, uh, that there's a cost, there's a potential cost there of being rejected, and there's
Mhm.
also even if you're not rejected, then there's a lot of work you have to put in. And I think that making things easy goes a long way. That's being underestimated. So maybe one of the things that's happening is that a lot of men are now finding AI girlfriends, and
Oh
this has
boy.
kind of led me. This is there are AI girlfriends are becoming big business now, and one of the things I was thinking is maybe we could use these AI girlfriends to actually train men to go out there and meet real girlfriends. You know, instead of
Oh
being a
boy.
substitute.
This is so
You know,
dystopian.
yeah. Instead of being a substitute, like maybe you could use these AI girlfriends to actually incentivize people to go out there and meet a real girlfriend by making them feel like they're improving their confidence, basically. Maybe that could
Mhm.
work. But again, like this
We
is
need to we need to fix testosterone levels, man. Like the testosterone levels are
yeah,
they've
that's
dropped
also
so hard that this is even becoming a conversation.
yeah, that's also an issue. But ultimately, one of the things that I do fear is whatever's easiest tends to take over. That tends to become the
Yes.
norm. Convenience culture is, I suppose, what we would call it. And so I'm trying to work out like the things that are what's going to become more convenient in the future, because usually that's a good way to predict the future. And this is why I'm worried about artificial wombs, because eventually it's going to become more convenient. I'm not talking about in the next decade or even in the next 50 years. I'm talking pretty far in the future. So next 100 years, right? This is my estimate. In the next 100 years, it will be easier to just print your own human than it would be to actually raise a human in the natural way. And so, what is that going to lead to? Like, because it's hard work to raise a child naturally,
Mhm.
not only for the woman like during pregnancy, but everything that comes after. For like 18 years, you have to raise this child. You have to dedicate your entire life to this child for 18 years, and even after that, you have to, take care of them. And it's like when you can do all of that in a few weeks, maybe in a month. You could grow a human in a week or a month.
But then it loses but then it loses all of its value, meaning and purpose.
That's a scary thought, and it's one that I think about a
Yeah.
lot. Because that's obviously most people aren't thinking about this because this is very very far in the future. We're not going to be able to do this for a long time, but it's going to happen, I think, eventually, and it's something we're going to have to think about at some point. Where
Do you know what I
what?
think? Oh, sorry. Carry on. I don't
Sorry,
mean
no,
to
no,
interrupt.
no, no, no. Sorry, I was pretty much done anyway.
I was going to say that I don't know what the mechanism is going to be, but I'm going to make a prediction about this prediction. And my prediction is that through some mechanism or some combination of unknown unknowns or ignored knowns, that this is going to massively implode and it's going to be a catastrophe. It's going. I believe it's some
Yeah.
like maybe this is the Christian in me, but I think that there's a level of man playing God where once it goes past a certain point of pursuing this so-called utopia, it always collapses and results in an undesirable utopia. I think once you're at the part of instead of people having sex and reproducing, you're making human beings in bags and people's girlfriends are AI and you're like doing I just think that at that point or before you get to that point, something goes so horribly wrong in the
Mm,
experiment that I'm not
yeah.
going to say like it wipes out humanity, probably not that extreme, but it causes some sort of massive reversion where it's like, okay, we need to go back to the old school way of doing things. That would be my
Yeah.
predictions. I don't know what that
Well,
mechanism will be, but I think that
yeah.
would happen.
Well, I agree with you, and it's funny because I'm not a Christian, but I agree with you 100%, and it's because I'm actually looking at evolution rather than Christianity. And for me, because I try to look at things from an evolutionary perspective, and the way I see things is that we're creating for ourselves a world we didn't evolve for. Uh, in other words, a world we're not adapted to. And what's happening is that the pace of technological evolution is outpacing biological evolution. So we're creating all of these changes to our society and to our environment faster than we can adapt to it. And this is accelerating over time because, as we said, earlier, technological growth is exponential. Evolution occurs on a much longer timescale. Like biological evolution occurs on a much longer timescale than technological development. And so the gap between the world that we're creating and the world that we evolve for is expanding. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is, again, a reason why I agree with you. I think that this is going to lead, I hope it doesn't, but I think it's going to lead to some kind of reckoning where we're going to have to, something bad is going to happen and we're going to have to work out how to get ourselves out of this hole. Um, I think that unfortunately, one of the things with people is that they tend not to take attention to problems until they get too big. So, there's this thing called the region beta paradox, which is basically explains this idea, which is that a lot of people won't sort of clean something until it gets really dirty. Like, for example, you won't wash your car unless a bird takes a big shit on it. Then you'll clean your whole car. But it takes something like a bird to shit on your car for you to clean it in the first place. So it's like with society, something really bad has to happen before people actually sit up and take notice and say, "Oh, okay, we radically need to change the way that we're doing things." And so far, we haven't reached that point. It seems like we're going to reach that point, but right now, things are comfortable enough for most people that people are just not worried about it. So people are focused. Another problem with our digital age is that people are focused on the short term because you know, all you have to do to be distracted now is just to switch on your phone, look into your phone or look into your laptop or strike up a conversation with someone. It's very easy to be distracted from what's going on in the world right now. You can, like, again, you can just choose your narrative. You can choose what you want to focus on. There are so many sources of information. And most people are just using this to essentially indoctrinate themselves into inaction by doom scrolling social media. And there's a weird paradox to this where people are spending a lot of time on social media and they're being fed all of this information about the world, but rather than make them more active and rather than make them more informed, it's making them less informed because what they're doing is they're just focusing on things that they can't do anything about, and they're not really focusing on things that they can do things about. So for example, um, people are focusing on what's going on the other side of the world because the news is telling them about this. Um, maybe there was some earthquake in China or something, and people are reading about it and commenting about it and having long, really robust discussions about it, even though they're on the other side of the world and this earthquake is not going to affect them personally. or maybe somebody's living in Europe and they're talking about what's going on with Trump, or whatever. So people are focusing on things that they can't materially affect, and this is taking up a lot of their time, a lot of their thinking time, and preventing them from thinking about things that they can actually do things about, things that are happening in their real lives. Things like, oh, maybe I should actually go out and meet a woman and start a family. Um, maybe I should start working out in the gym and fixing my life. These are things they can actually fix, but they're not, because they're focusing on these abstract problems that are going on all the world. So this is another problem that's been added to the mix, is that social media essentially distances people from the doom that possibly awaits them, where we're going to be focusing, will people be arguing over what color a dress is, whether it's blue or white, rather than actually what are we going to survive the next century? Is my lineage going to survive? Are my genes going to die out? So one of the things that I'm very interested in now is trying to cultivate ignorance. Right? I think that ignorance is a skill. It's a skill. Ignorance used to be a bad thing. It used to be a bad thing, but now it's a good thing overall, as long as you're doing it consciously, because there are so many things trying to get our attention. There are so many things trying to pull us in this direction or that, away from where we actually want to go. And I think one thing that people are underestimating is the power of ignorance in these times. When there is not much information around, ignorance is a bad thing, because every bit of information counts. But when you're faced with information overload, you need to cultivate ignorance. You need to be able to say no. You need to be able to not react to things and to focus on what you're trying to do in your life, because everything else is trying to pull you away in that. And the way I look at it is, if you're in a world of darkness, right, you want to open your eyes, because then your eyes will adapt to the darkness and you'll see. If you are faced with glaring, blinding light like we are in our over-illuminated age of information overload, the thing to do is to shut your eyes. That's how you see. Let's say if you're faced with extreme light, if you look into that light, you're going to be blinded. So if you want to preserve your vision, you have to shut your eyes. And essentially, that's the kind of situation in which we're in right now, where we have just too much information, and most of this information is junk. It's like the psychological equivalent of fast food. It's information that's been produced quickly to try and get your attention. And it might taste good, but it's not nutritious. It's created purely to sell it. That's what most of the information in the world is now. It's there to get your attention. And one of the things that we have to do, if we want to focus on solving both the short-term problems and the long-term problems, is that we need to cultivate ignorance of most of the stuff that we see. And we need to be focused. Focus is so much more important now than it's ever been, because of the number of distractions that we face.
That's a very, very astute point. I'm just reflecting on what we were talking about sort of the future. And I think there's one more very important human and social element that will actually shape some of these things, which tends to be underrated because you can't really measure it or quantify it. But that is what is cool, aspirational, and provides status. I think human beings are so status driven that if we could somehow predict what will be considered cool and what will be considered high status and aspirational, and I think we can predict that somewhat well, because it's probably not going to change that much from what it currently is and has previous been. I think that's going to be a big spanner in the works of all this. It's part of the reason why, sometimes I look at the rising obesity rates, and if you were to extrapolate, you'd end up at a point where like 95% of the population is obese within the next 70 years or something like that. But I think the truth is, having a fit body is always going to be more aspirational and cool than being obese. So no matter how much certain narratives are pushed and how much junk food is out there and so on, there will always remain a subset of people who have fit bodies and they're really healthy, and people aspire to be like that. So even when it comes to things like dating and marriage and relationships and even having children, if it is seen as cool, if it's seen as high status to actually, hey, cool, like I'm someone who's got children and I've got a family, and look, I did it the old school way. If that is seen as cooler and more high status, then whatever strange Brave New World alternative may pop up, then I think that could actually throw that could be like a very significant factor in what the future looks like, because something could be possible, but if it's possible but it's seen as low status or just like ew or undesirable in some way, um, it could flop even though it's something that is technically available. Does that kind of make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, I think that's a good point. And
Yeah.
I actually think that there has been, fortunately, there is hope here. Actually, this is a source of hope because I was quite pessimistic about this a couple of years ago because I wrote an article about TikTok, and in the article, while I was researching that article, I found that in a massive survey of both Chinese and Western kids, they were asked what their number one aspiration was, and the Chinese kids said that they wanted to be an astronaut, and the Western kids said that they wanted to be an influencer. And I thought, well, we're not gonna make it, in the West if that's the aspirations of our kids compared to the Chinese. Do you know what I mean? But I've since gained a bit of hope because I think one of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is this sort of the rise to prominence of Elon Musk on X especially. And look, I don't think Elon's a perfect guy. I think some of the stuff he says might be a bit crazy. He's got his flaws certainly, but he's offered young men in particular something that they just didn't have before, right? Because if you look at, I think like wokeism is kind of dying now. I think it's starting to die out. And I think Elon has played a big part in this. He's obviously not the reason alone. It's not just him, but he has played a part in it. And I think one of the reasons why wokeism is dying is because wokeism was sort of premised on a kind of quite a feminine way of thinking, which is that what we should aspire to is to be good to other people, to care for other people, to be empathic, compassionate to other people. That's what we should aspire to. And this is probably an idea that appeals to women in particular. It's quite a feminine way of thinking. Empathy is quite a feminine trait. And so it probably satisfied a lot of women, but it didn't satisfy men, right? Because when you're a young man, it's just not enough to just be a nice person, right? That's not enough for a young man. That's not gonna inspire a young man, right? Being a good person is good. We should aspire to it, but it's not sufficient. And what Elon has done is he's given young men something to hope for, which is going to Mars, right? That's an absolutely wild and amazing and inspiring thing to look for. And I think what that's done is that's given people, and men especially, something else to hope for. But the thing with going to Mars is it requires greatness. You need to be a great person. You need to cultivate strength and intelligence and courage and wisdom to do that. And so there's been this kind of drive, and Elon's not the only guy. He's not the only guy doing this. I think there's been a movement in the tech right generally, but he's like the kind of figurehead. But there's been a lot of other people, like Peter Thiel, who have also, Mark Andreessen. A lot of these guys in the sort of Silicon Valley have now embraced this new sort of this kind of technological. Some people call it a cult, right? Which is like accelerationism, EAC. And there's kind of been a bit of there's been this rift on the right between these kind of EAC guys and the more traditional conservatives. But I think one thing, I don't agree with the EAC guys on
Sorry,
everything.
when
Right?
when
I think
when you
they're
when you said EAC, what did you say that stands for?
so that's basically accelerationism. So
Okay.
it's effective. It stands for effective accelerationism, and it's basically a new
Okay.
philosophy. It emerged sort of as a reaction to effective altruism. So effective altruism is this kind of more feminine way of looking at things, where you try to do good for your fellow man or woman, and you try to do it in the most rational way you can. And effective accelerationism is a rejection of that. It's basically like, no, we shouldn't focus on just doing the best for a fellow man now. What we should focus on is trying to create greatness for humanity. We should try to accelerate technological growth and try to do some amazing things like going to Mars, For some people, it means creating a super intelligent AI. Others are a bit frightened of it. There's different factions, but the general idea of accelerationism in this context is that we should accelerate technological growth. So in a way, it could be seen as quite bad because it would be maybe leading us headfirst into these problems that we've been discussing. But on the other hand, it gives young men this aspiration. It gives young men something to hope for. This futurism, essentially. The detractors are saying it's like a cult that worships the singularity, or worships the future, or whatever. Basically, it will be a new religion that worships AI. That's what the detractors say. The proponents say that this is going to fix all of our problems because we will have super intelligent AIs to make all of our hard decisions for us. They'll be able to make better decisions than any single human being can. We'll be going to Mars. We'll be, expanding humanity through the stars. And, it won't just be one civilization. We'll have multiple civilizations all across the universe. And so it will maximize the chances of human greatness. And so this has become, I think, something that has captured the imaginations of young men. And you see the support for Elon is huge. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why, Trump especially as well has also, there's been a resurgence of support for Trump because he's embraced AI. When he gave his commencement, not his commencement, when he gave his opening speech for his administration, there was Sam Altman and other tech leaders were in the front row, during his speech, which shows, and he placed them there. These were people before his own cabinet. Even his own cabinet were behind these people. So Trump has basically become very interested in embracing technology now. You heard about this Stargate, this $500 million Stargate thing that they're planning. So Elon, Trump, Andreessen, Thiel, all these guys, they're basically giving young men, for better or worse, it might not necessarily be a good thing, but they're giving men this new sort of sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, which I'm optimistic about generally. I know that there's problems with it. I know that unfettered technological acceleration can be a bad thing. If it's not accompanied by wisdom, it could be a terrible thing. It could be a disastrous thing. So I'm cautious about it, but I'm cautiously optimistic because I think young men have not had something like this to aspire to for a very long time. I think the last time we really had this in the West was the space race, where we were competing with Russia, and that led to greatness. The 1940s and 50s were a time of greatness in at least in American technological development, and it led to good, I think, strong cultural mores as well. And so I'm cautiously optimistic about this new direction, this new sort of inspiring sort of drive towards Mars, and less so towards artificial general intelligence. I think that's a bit more perilous, but I think that gives young men something to aim for. And that could be this thing that you're talking about, this aspiration that would help to keep humanity active and engaged in the world, engaged in reality. Because the good thing about going to Mars is that you need to understand reality if you're going to go to Mars. You can't use diversity and equity and inclusion to go to Mars. You need to actually have the best in the world. You need to have merit to go to Mars. And so to take on these big, hard, difficult tasks, that may be what we need as a species, because that is what will propel young people, and particularly young men, to greatness.
Gurwinder, we could talk for many, many, many hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. And of course, I'd love to have you back on in the future. I've really enjoyed this conversation. We've touched on such an interesting range of topics, and I love the way your mind works. You're a fantastic writer as well. Before we close out, where can my listeners find and follow you online?
Okay, so the main place is my my blog, which is just gurwinder.blog. That's where I tend to write my long form pieces. And you can also follow me on X as well. Just type in Gurwinder X and you'll probably find me. Yeah.
Awesome. Gurwinder, man, it's been a pleasure talking to you at last. I feel like this podcast has been long overdue. Keep on writing, keep on thinking, and I'm intrigued to see what you put out there in the future.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Zuby. Cheers.
Thanks for your time, man.